I've been playing Wreckfest and having a lot of fun with it. The loose physics, varied terrain, and the way the cars slide around the track remind me of a 1970s-style car chase. Someone should really make a driver sequel with that codebase. But more than its physics, it got me thinking about the design of racing games and the races within them. I am by no means an expert in the racing game genre, but I do check in with it about once a generation or so. From when Grid helped kick off the event-style campaign that games like Wreckfest have, to Forza Horizon 4 and its variants on the open-world genre. But as much of these games have changed over the years, at the end of the day, they're still about racing. That's the core activity. But more importantly, they're about coming in first. And that's the part I want to talk about today. Talladega Nights was a mid-aughts Will Ferrell comedy whose quotes became sort of water-cooler proto-memes, such as the film's arc words, "If you aren't first, you're last." That quote was the main character being an ass. Racing in the real world rarely works that way. In something like NASCAR, you have an entire season, with the drivers earning a number of points depending on where they placed in the race. Those points are added up across the season to determine the standings. It's not a big deal if you came in third place this race or fifth place the next, so long as you consistently perform well. This is rarely if ever reflected in racing games, in which first place is generally the only thing that matters. Players are expected to win every race, every time, with anything other than first considered to be a failure state. Sure, we might upgrade our cars or graduate to more difficult tournaments, but this effect is largely nullified by the increased difficulty of the AI opponents. The player is still expected to finish first every time, whether in the minor leagues or the biggest pro event. At least when it comes to video games, Will Ferrell was right. You're either first or you're last. You either won the race or you lost. There's no in between. The default difficulty in Wreckfest is a little on the easy side. That's fine, I'm not here for a racing version of Dark Souls, but that meant I spent much of my time in the front of the pack. And a funny thing happens in racing games when you're in the lead. You stop racing the other drivers, and you start racing yourself. It's not about catching the guy in front of you, it's about seeing how fast you can complete a lap, how well you can take the turns. You're no longer racing, you're basically playing a glorified time trial. Some might say to turn up the difficulty, but that's not really the point. Even if I made the difficulty as hard as it could be, the game's design wants me to be in first place all the time. It wants me to win every single race, to be out in front of the pack, staring at empty fields and hoping I don't crash. What's really interesting to me is that being in first place, the goal of the game's design, is one of the least interesting parts of racing. A race is far more visceral, far more exciting when you're fighting through the pack, trying to get to that lead position rather than meticulously maintaining that position out in front. As they say in NASCAR, rubbing is racing. Through playing, however, it becomes clear that being mid-pack isn't enough on its own. You spot this pretty easily once the cars become spread out. As the distance between the cars increase, the race becomes more static, and once more we find ourselves racing our own best time, not the other drivers. The same problems emerge when in last place, too, staring at an empty field with cars too far in the distance to matter. The player stops engaging with the race and instead works on improving their own route around the track. It's the exact same experience as racing when in first place. The only difference is that the game's career progression rewards one and punishes the other, even when they're functionally the same game state. The game's career progression, which could alleviate this with a points-based system like in NASCAR or various upgrades, often don't. Content is withheld from the player until they finish in first place often enough, and upgrades don't serve to make the player better, they serve to keep the player even with the competition, reminiscent of level scaling in something like Skyrim or the progression in Diablo. Each area, each tournament, each level in the dungeon is effectively the same. Whether a player gets a +2 sword or a carburetor with faster acceleration is largely mitigated by the increased ability of the monsters on the next level, the better cars in the next tournament. The career progression in the races say the same thing. Get out in front, stay there for X number of laps, until the race is over. Repeat. I think action games are an interesting parallel here because at the end of the day, racing games are about, well, racing, and the goal of a race is to finish in first place. So why shouldn't the goal of the game be to have the player finish first? It's all pretty logical. Well, in action games, the goal is to win the fight. Every fight, against every enemy. You either live through the fight, finishing in first place, or you die. But in an action game, the combat itself has an ebb and a flow to it. Sometimes you're on the offensive, and sometimes you're on the defensive. The goal is to win the fight, sure, but there's a variance within that fight. In a racing game, this would be analogous to being in the middle of the pack, gaining places and losing them in an ultimate effort to win the race. And in a career mode, this would be analogous to winning some races and losing others. But we don't see that in racing games. All we see is the drive to win. Every race, every time. Compare this not only to real racing, but sports movies too. In a sports movie, be it baseball, football, or a romantic comedy, the team often wins, loses, and then wins again. Writers do this because it brings tension, it creates drama. There'd be no point in watching a movie about a team that won easily every single game forever. That's boring. So why do we do the same thing in our racing games? I think what I would really like to see is a career mode that expected you to progress as a driver. Maybe something with skill points that made the driver better over time, or something where you started out in a really crappy car, finishing the first tournament at the back of the pack. You get a little bit of prize money to help improve your car. Then in the next tournament, you'd be expected to finish in a middle place, until ultimately building up your car and your driver to the point where they can compete with the very best in the pro tournaments. I'd like to see more racing games where racing is more about the climb than the finish, where there's more than just first and last. I'm Mike Laguero. Thanks for watching. I have a new novella out. It's called I'm Bored. It's a romance thriller, which is not traditionally what I write, but which I think you'll like if you give it a chance. If you want to support the channel, you can check it out on Google Play or Amazon Kindle. Links to both in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.